The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are three of the most popular religions in the world today, and each has different holy books. While canon lists may be different between traditions, it's broadly true that the holy books of these traditions are the Tanakh, the Christian Bible, and the Qur'an, respectively. The Christian Bible includes the Tanakh, but does not include the Qur'an, while the Qur'an does not explicitly include either the Old or New Testament, but does include quotes from them, as well as endorsements and criticisms of both. Our principal focus here will be on the Qur'an. In addition, there are, for each of these religions, a number of works of great importance which are not strictly part of their central holy texts, such as rabbinical literature, apocrypha, sira literature, and the Hadith. The latter two terms are of primary importance in understanding the Qur'an from a traditional Islamic perspective. According to Fred M. Donner, the sira literature was compiled by Muslim sages during the several hundred years following Muhammad's death, and offers a richly detailed account of Muhammad's life, of his receipt of the revelations that are enshrined in the Quranic text, and, although less fully, of the codification of the revelation in the years following his death to produce the text of the Qur'an as we have it today. Like the biographies found in sira literature, Hadith are considered trustworthy records of Muhammad's life and ideas within Islamic tradition and law. They are often used to explain the origins and interpretation of different parts of the Qur'an. These accounts are not, however, the only worthwhile resources for understanding the context and history of the Qur'an. Modern academic scholarship provides an account of the Qur'an and its formation, which often conflicts with the traditional account. Usually, this scholarship draws on a broad range of resources, limited not only to the previously mentioned traditional sources, but also historical manuscripts, inscriptions, and related literature, among other sources. As with the Bible, the Qur'an has a complex textual history. Changes in verses or chapters between manuscripts is to be expected, with some manuscripts having hundreds of differences between their presentation and the modern Arabic Qur'an, and others having fewer differences. Most of these differences have been due to simple scribal error, a common issue for ancient literature. These manuscripts, along with other evidence such as Qur'an quotes inscribed into art and architecture, demonstrate changes in the Qur'an over time and bring into question traditional Islamic ideas about the Qur'an, such as the idea that the Qur'an has been perfectly preserved through time. This academic account of the Qur'an's history has been steadily gaining interest among scholars over the past half-century. According to Harold Motzke, from the 1970s onwards, several assertions about the origin and formation of the Qur'an have been the object of detailed revision, and the results of these studies more often than not have challenged the accepted wisdom. The year 1970 can thus be considered a watershed in the scholarly history of the research. So, what is the Qur'an? What can these roughly 50 years of academic research tell us about it? What can Islamic tradition tell us about it? Let's find out. What is the traditional account of the Qur'an and its history? Non-Muslims may understand the Qur'an to be a book like any other, but Muslims don't believe that to be the case. Many Muslims today will tell you that it is a book from Allah, which existed long before the life of Muhammad. In its original form, the Qur'an is said to be on a well-guarded tablet or preserved tablet. The Arabic Qur'an we have today is supposed to be a perfect representation of the contents of that tablet. Mahmoud Ayub describes this conception of the Qur'an as follows. The Qur'an is a unique sacred book. It is believed to be at one and the same time a glorious Qur'an, eternally preserved with God in the well-guarded tablet, and a book of moral and spiritual guidance. It is accepted by all Islamic legal and theological schools as the Word of God that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad throughout his prophetic career piecemeal in portions of unequal length. This well-guarded tablet is supposed to be eternally preserved and has an otherworldly feeling to it. It raises many questions. Is the tablet itself in Arabic? Or is the Arabic of the Qur'an only an approximation of its contents? When exactly was it created? Why would a monotheistic God need language at the point of creation, and moreover, why would he need to record information on a tablet? How are claims about the delivery of information from a mystic tablet any different than similar claims like those from John Dee or Joseph Smith? On its face, the claim of such a tablet's existence seems absurd. For those of us who don't accept claims about such a tablet, we might wonder why such claims might have come to exist in the first place. W. St. Clair Tisdall explained that the idea of such a tablet originally came from the story in Deuteronomy, where the Ten Commandments were given to Moses on tablets, which were placed in the Ark of the Covenant. Tisdall wrote that these tablets eventually were thought to contain things beyond the law of Yahweh. In spite of the fact that Deuteronomy clearly states that only the Ten Commandments were written upon these tablets, the belief arose among Jews that all the books of the Old Testament and also the whole of the Talmud were either inscribed upon them or at least given along with them. When Muhammad heard this assertion, it was natural for him to assert that his revelation too was written upon one of these preserved tablets. Otherwise, he thought he could hardly claim for it a degree of authority equal to that of the Old Testament. He further identified this belief as having been preserved in Jewish literature. The legend about the preserved tablet upon which the Qur'an is said to have been written is derived from a Jewish source. In the Pikre Alath, Cap 5:6, it is said that the 2 tablets of the law were created, along with 9 other things, at the time of the creation of the world, and at sunset, before the first Sabbath began. It is noteworthy that heavenly tablets aren't only in the aforementioned sources. They actually appear throughout the Bible and in apocryphal texts. Jubilees, for example, contains numerous references to the heavenly tablets. Those heavenly tablets may be the same as this well-guarded tablet. They may be related in some way, or they may have no relation. Stories about otherworldly tablets are not entirely uncommon in religious traditions in general. The tradition also predates Judaism, as tablets of destiny appeared in Sumerian mythology, though the contents of those tablets aren't well defined in any reputable sources I'm aware of. Muhammad, according to Tisdall, would likely have heard of holy books being preserved on tablets, like those believed in by the Jews. He concludes that the claim of eternal preservation was, from the start, an attempt to establish the legitimacy of the Quran as a holy text to believers in the God of Abraham, based on the information Muhammad had about the Abrahamic traditions at the time. According to Islamic tradition, the contents of this tablet were communicated by the angel Gabriel to a prophet. This prophet, who delivered the Quran, was a man named Muhammad. He is described in brief by Mahmud Ayyub. Muhammad was born in the city of Makkah, in Arabia, in 569 or 570 CE. He is believed to have been chosen by God to be his messenger to the Arabs and the rest of humankind. Thus, he is called Al-Mustafa, the elect of God. Muhammad is believed by Muslims, as the Quran itself asserts, to be God's messenger and the seal of the prophets. The Quran is likewise regarded as God's final revelation to humankind. Muhammad is believed by Muslims to be the seal of the prophets, which functionally means that he is the final prophet to be sent by God. Putting forward a complete biography of the life of Muhammad goes beyond the scope of this video. But here are the essential details. Islamic sources report that Muhammad was visited by the angel Gabriel. Gabriel told Muhammad the contents of the Qur'an, and Muhammad delivered what he was told in oral presentations. This means that Muhammad is not the author of the Qur'an in Islam. Rather, the Qur'an is the direct word of Allah, given to Muhammad by Gabriel, and given to the public by Muhammad. Traditional Islamic sources show Muhammad growing up and eventually preaching in communities of pagans, especially a tribe in the region called the Quraysh, and occasionally in communities of believers in the God of Abraham. Believers in the God of Abraham were not often given substantive mentions in the biographies of Muhammad outside of some specific events. Gabriel Reynolds holds that the textual evidence within the Quran demonstrates a decidedly less pagan-centric origin for the Quran's authorship. The Quran's great concern with a transcendent God, and in particular its refutation of the Christian teaching of the Incarnation, suggests that Islam was first preached in a context where Christian debates over theology and Christology were a topic of general interest. Such a situation doesn't sound particularly like what is written about the religion of the people surrounding Muhammad in his biographies. Pagans were more than likely present and active, but there wasn't a noteworthy absence of Abrahamic believers in the region. The traditional account of Muhammad's life is questionable, and no non-Islamic sources from the purported time of Muhammad make any mention of a prophet named Muhammad. In fact, they make no mentions of a prophet in the region of Mecca during Muhammad's time at all. Because the historical existence of Muhammad is questionable, whether or not he originally delivered the Quran, either orally or in writing, is not a settled fact. It may be the case that the Quran was developed under extremely different circumstances than is described in the biographies of Muhammad, if, in fact, Muhammad never existed. However, as either a historic or fictional person, Muhammad is basically inseparable from the Quran. The story of Muhammad's life has dramatically impacted the presentation of modern and ancient copies of the Quran, as well as commentaries on the text. In some cases, the Quran is even presented in a constructed order of revelation. Many modern translations of the Quran list surahs in the order of 1 through 114. Others present the Quran by attempting to reconstruct the order of surahs into their original order of revelation. In accounts of the order of revelation, surahs are broken down into different categories. Surahs in the Quran generally fit into three basic categories: early Meccan sutras, later Meccan sutras, and Medinan sutras. These two locations, Mecca and Medina, are very important locations in Islam, as they are the primary areas where Muhammad lived and spread the message of Allah. Muhammad's journey from Mecca to Medina is called the Hijrah, and this pilgrimage serves as the starting point of the Islamic calendar. The placement of an individual surah as Meccan or Medinan is based on speculation of when in Muhammad's life individual surahs were delivered to him. We will return to the importance of the Hijrah in Islam shortly. For now, let's focus on the surahs themselves. Angelica Neuwirth explains the early Meccan surahs as follows. The spectrum of different themes and their combinations is very broad in early Meccan times. Surah types range from single-part pieces, pure lampoon, hijah, pure exhortations through the prophet, pure eschatological discourse, to bipartite ones, oath cluster, and eschatological section, to the later standardized tripartite surah, exhortation, polemics, and affirmation of the Quran. She describes the later Meccan surahs as different, often blurring the tripartite form with new literary features. In these surahs, references to the Meccan sanctuary, Haram, as the central warrant for the social coherence of the community have been replaced by new symbols. Instead of introductory allusions to liturgical times and sacred space, we encounter an evocation of the book, be it clad in an oath or in a deictic affirmation of its presence. The Medinan surahs are described as being more rhetorical but less sophisticated, losing their tripartite scheme. She describes the features of these surahs as follows. One type may be summarily termed the rhetorical surah or sermon. They consist of an address to the community by formulas such as, "O people." In these surahs, which in some cases are stereotypically introduced by initial hymnal formulas strongly reminiscent of the biblical Psalms, the prophet, al-Nabi, appears no longer as a mere transmitter of the message, but as personally addressed by God, "O prophet," or as an agent acting in combination with the divine persona, God and his messenger. These are not the only noteworthy features of the Qur'an as read in the traditional order of revelation. Events in the life of Muhammad, according to the traditional accounts, seem to have influenced the surahs. Some events are even cited by traditional Islamic scholars as being the reason why Muhammad received certain revelations from Allah. And as the social situations Muhammad found himself in changed, the attitudes of his delivered surahs changed. This was a continual development in Muhammad's life, but was deeply impacted by the Hijrah. W. St. Clair Tisdall details this change in attitude as follows. Before AD 622, Muhammad had no temporal power. Accordingly, in those verses and surahs which were composed before the Hijrah, no mention whatsoever is made of the duty of taking up arms for the spread of the faith, or even in self-defense. But after the Hijrah, when many of the people of Medina had become his helpers, he in the first place gave permission to his companions to fight for the protection of their own lives. After a time, when victory had attended Muhammad on several plundering expeditions directed against the caravans belonging to the Quraysh, this permission was turned into a command. This change from relative pacifism to acceptance of militant ideas has had a special impact on Islam due to a principle in Islamic law called naskh, or abrogation. Just like the Bible, there are various points at which the Quran contradicts itself, either directly or in principle, even within a single copy, without even considering differences between manuscripts. Disputes over these differences led to the adoption of naskh, which in essence dictates that in an instance of disagreement between two surahs, the one which was written later in Muhammad's life is given legal priority. This change over time and confusion about the ordering of surahs provides the opportunity for contradictory views about Islamic ideology, both to Muslims and non-Muslims. One may claim that Islam is a religion of peace, or that it is a violent ideology, and have legitimate points supporting either side. Depending on the order of revelation, either position may be ultimately correct. Muslims may live in accordance with only the morality presented in certain parts of the Quran and still claim to be living in accordance with Islamic law. However, if abrogation is the correct way of determining how one should behave under Islamic law, those more violent passages in the commonly considered later surahs may be more representative of how Islam should be according to the tradition as written. Suppose that the order is incorrect, and that, in reality, the most violent surahs were delivered first and the most peaceful were delivered last. If that were the case, the principle of abrogation would probably not present many ethical problems. So how is it that we can determine when a certain verse was delivered exactly? How can we be sure that this presentation in order of revelation is accurate? Analyzing the Quran in accordance with the biographies of Muhammad provides for the opportunity of presentations in the order of revelation. However, always take the order with a grain of salt. It isn't clear that there was a historic Muhammad, and even if he did exist, It isn't clear which supplementary literature provides accurate information about the order of revealed surahs. Some traditional sources contradict other traditional sources, and some presentations of the Qur'an in the order of revelation are wildly different than others. Because of this ambiguity, the principle of abrogation continues to present potential ethical problems. Islamic tradition holds that both during and after Muhammad's life, many people memorized the surahs he delivered orally. Surahs were also recorded on various surfaces, such as parchment, bone, and skins. But after Muhammad's death, he was no longer around to deliver surahs and correct improper recitations. Islamic tradition holds that Zayd ibn Thabit compiled the Quran from the aforementioned sources, which he gave to Abu Bakr, the first caliph, or Muslim figurehead. This copy was reportedly handed down from Abu Bakr to Umar, the second caliph, who left it with his daughter, one of Muhammad's widows. Then came the third caliph, Uthman, under whose leadership the Quran would see a radical change. Mahmud Ayub summarizes the actions of Uthman, referred to by some as the Uthmanic Redaction. Under the auspices of the third caliph, Uthman bi Affan, Zayd headed a committee of 4 men who relied on Hafsa's collection in producing the official recension of the Quran, henceforth known as Al-Mushaf al-Uthman, the Uthmanic Codex. It is this Uthmanic Mushaf, with minor orthographic emendations and proper vocalization, which was collected within less than 20 years of the death of the Prophet, that remains the official written Quran of all Muslims. Part of this standardization effort included the destruction of defunct or outdated copies of the Quran. They were burned, thrown in rivers, or disposed of in other ways. Some may have been edited by hand to meet Uthmanic standards. Possession of this Uthmanic Codex would be of great value in understanding the Quran in its historical context. However, it doesn't seem to exist anymore. Daniel Allen Brubaker notes on the Uthmanic Codex, given the monumental nature of what tradition reports the third caliph, Uthman, to have done with the standardization of the text, the suppression of variants via burning or other means of destruction, and the production of authoritative copies that were then to serve as exemplars and standards against which subsequent copies could be measured, it is odd that no copy existing today has been reliably identified as one of these actual authoritative copies, and that the ones about which such a claim is made seem to have been produced long after Uthman's time. The lack of an extant modern copy of the Uthmanic Codex has caused some to claim that it is mythological, that it never existed. However, there is reason to suspect that it may have existed at some point in time. At least, some kind of redaction likely took place, even if it wasn't under Uthman. Neuwirth wrote on the Uthmanic Redaction, "The compositional sequence of the Quranic surahs does not follow any logical, let alone theological, guideline, and betrays both a conservative and a theologically disinterested attitude on the part of the redactors. It suggests that the redaction was carried out at a stage of development prior to the emergence of the elaborate conceptions of prophetology that underlie the sira. The fixation of the Quranic text must also have occurred before the great conquests, since the unification of various textual traditions would have been difficult to implement. The traditional scenario of the Uthmanic redaction is thus not implausible, though impossible to prove positively. Even today, there are Qurans with different numbers of surahs and different contents than the current standard. Uthman's standardization campaign was clearly not entirely successful, and further standardization campaigns would be put in place after Uthman, as Brubaker wrote. Although it seems to have been reasonably demonstrated by now that most surviving Quran manuscripts bear the signs of having been produced following a campaign of standardization, basically consistent with that reported to have been directed by the third caliph, It is also clear that there existed some differences of perception about the correct words of the Qur'an text at the time most of these manuscripts were produced, which were later revisited when these perceptions changed, or standardization became more thorough. If you ask a random Muslim about the history of the Qur'an, they might reject that any differences have ever existed, and instead tell you that the Qur'an has been perfectly preserved through time via oral transmission. Many people have memorized the Qur'an, and some claim that changes in the Qur'an would be impossible due to the number of people who have memorized it. The claim may be made that even if an individual misremembered a verse, they would likely be corrected by another person who remembered it correctly. But strict memorization of the Qur'an hasn't historically led to perfect preservation, as is evident by the fact that any standardization efforts have been made at all. Anyone who has ever played a game of telephone as a child understands that sometimes information can be lost or altered along the way in oral transmission. Even early in the history of the Qur'an, it may have been the case that oral transmission was not the primary method of teaching the Qur'an. Daniel Allen Brubaker comments, "Indeed, there is little reason to doubt that oral transmission played a significant role in those early years. However, the existence of manuscripts attests also to a tradition of written transmission, and features of the manuscripts also suggest the practice of scribal copying from an exemplar. So it is more likely that orality was part of the picture, but also that the major transmission of the book was not purely oral." According to Angelica Neuwirth, this scribal practice was not likely limited to later renditions of the Qur'an. Rather, it is likely that many surahs originally were written compositions rather than oral compositions. Some early surahs that were already composed without written assistance attest to an origin the nocturnal vigils rather than in public performances. Later surahs, composed of multipartite technical devices, strongly suggest an almost immediate fixation in writing, or may even have been written compositions to begin with. Neuwirth adds that early scribal copies were not exactly like the books we use today. They were, according to her, more akin to tools used in memorization and recollection than books meant to be read cover to cover by an unfamiliar reader. Readers of the text would be expected to have memorized it to a major degree. However, to claim that the Qur'an has had perfect transmission, and a perfect oral transmission at that, is simply untrue. Different communities have different Qur'ans. Different people pronounce different words in the Qur'an differently, and that can lead to major differences in recitation. The history of the Qur'an doesn't stop with ancient manuscripts and a single standardization campaign. It has been translated into many languages, and at times it has been translated by Muslims, at other times by non-Muslims, and at some times by people who were explicitly anti-Muslim. Andrew Rippon describes some of the major early translations of the Qur'an. The first printed translation of the Qur'an, commonly called the Bibliander edition, appeared in 1543. In the 17th century, the printing of Qur'an translations became widespread through the efforts of Ludovico Maracci. His work included a printed Arabic text, but also interspersed refutations of Quranic claims, with sections of translation and text. An edited version in 1721 by Christian Reynesius removed the extraneous parts of Maracci's work, as well as the Arabic text, and it served as the basis for popular understandings of the Qur'an in European circles for some time. Translations have been put forward in English by George Sale in 1734 in a roughly chronological presentation by Reverend J. M. Rodwell in 1861 and by Professor E. H. Palmer in 1876, among others by non-Muslim translators. In the 20th century, Muslims began producing their own English translations, such as Dr. Muhammad Abdul Hakim Khan's 1919 tradition. In the 20th century, Muslims began producing their own English translations. such as Dr. Muhammad Abdul Hakim Khan's 1919 translation, Hafiz Ghulam Sarwar's translation published in 1929 or 1930, and Marmaduke Pickthall's 1930 translation. Most modern Qur'ans, however, are based on the 1924 Cairo edition. In 1924, an effort was made to standardize the written Qur'an. This standardization occurred in Cairo, Egypt, as the result of issues in Egyptian classrooms. Children were required to have Qur'ans to study for school, but there were individual differences in the Qur'ans which continually led to confusion in Egyptian classrooms. Egypt's solution was the 1924 Cairo edition. This standardization, which contains 114 surahs, is what most people today would consider to be the Qur'an. The standardization effort in 1924 was not limited only to new copies of the Qur'an. Brubaker points out so-called corrections in early manuscripts of the Qur'an, that is, literal modifications to early manuscripts placed in them long after their writing. Most of the time, I have found that corrections in a Qur'an manuscript result in conformity of that manuscript at the point of correction with the rasm of the now standard 1924 Cairo edition. This pattern is important and shows a general movement over time towards conformity, though not immediate, complete conformity. While these efforts to modify early manuscripts provide the world with more consistent copies of the Qur'an, they also make understanding changes made to the text over time more difficult. To compound this difficulty, not only was the Qur'an standardized in 1924, it was likely standardized over a long period of time and over multiple standardization campaigns. These standardization efforts would see older manuscripts changed over time, resulting in the corrections which Brubaker outlines with clear pictures and explanations in the book Corrections in Early Qur'an Manuscripts, which I suggest to anyone who wants to see some examples of these changes covered in great depth. In truth, there exist Qur'ans today which are not in accordance with the 114 surahs of the standard 1924 Cairo edition. The Qur'an, then, is in a sense a book in continuous development, going through long periods of standardization and re-standardization even into the 20th century. The reality of the situation is far from claims made of perfect preservation, oral or otherwise. Let's return to the question at hand. What is the Qur'an? Could have a number of answers depending on who you ask. Objectively, it's a book with 114 chapters, or surahs, in its modern form. These surahs are not always presented in an order which makes narrative sense in English translations. Because of its lack of a coherent narrative structure in some English presentations, a completely unfamiliar English reader of the Qur'an might interpret it as a loosely connected collection of stories and ideas. The Qur'an is by no means uniform in terms of structure or even genre. The attempt to find a distinctive genre that the Qur'an or even individual surahs fit into or generally fit into is a difficult task. Adam Flowers, in an essay where he identified 9 different literary genres in Surah 3 alone, details this issue. The problem of defining individual genres of Quranic discourse is further complicated by the relationship between the genre and the surah. The diversity among the Qur'an's 114 surahs exacerbates this problem, as it appears that some surahs exist as a single genre, others as compilations of multiple instances of a single genre, and still others as compilations of various types of genre. Analyzing the genre of the Qur'an as a whole depends on the presentation of the book's chapters. As was previously mentioned, the order of the chapters, or surahs, in the Qur'an is not uniform across all translations and presentations of the text. Some order the surahs roughly by length, while others attempt to reconstruct a chronology of revelation. Changes in the presentation may deeply influence a reader's interpretation of the Qur'an, as pointed out by Todd Lawson. If the Qur'an is read in the chronological order of revelation, the subject matter and form of the verses strongly suggest a version or rendition of apocalypse, especially with the affirmation of revelation from an unseen realm through the agency of a supernatural being, the nearness of the hour, natural dislocations, and catastrophes of a miraculous nature, entwined with the theme of judgment and the breathtaking absence of any hint of narrative movement. However, when read in the order of the Mushaf, the situation is quite otherwise. After a few introductory verses of invocation, prayer, and petition, we are fully involved in the historical beginnings of humankind on earth with the story of Adam, followed by the story of Moses, and so on. In addition, reading the text of the Qur'an itself, especially in early manuscripts, is a difficult task. What is presented in many written versions of the Qur'an is not much more than a skeletal text, which contains only certain letters. Certain letters which would help tremendously in understanding the meaning of the Arabic words are omitted completely. New Earth describes this writing style as follows. The Arabic script used for the earliest codification only incompletely rendered the phonetic shape of the text. A number of consonants were rendered by a single homograph that only later was differentiated through points placed above or below the letter form into specific graphemes. Quranic Arabic, like Biblical Hebrew, is notoriously difficult to translate. Vowels are not always provided, which leaves ample room for interpretation even among native Arabic speakers. According to New Earth, this suggests that early copies of the Quran served as mnemonic devices, which someone who had already memorized the Quran would use in recitation. Whether these Qurans were meant as tools for recollection or as tools for learning, the presentation of this skeletal text presents issues in interpretations of the text. A wide range of possible translations can be provided for different words and phrases within the Quran, based on different vocalizations of the presented words. The resulting linguistic confusion can lead to wildly different theological interpretations of the contents of the Quran, an unfortunate consequence of a seemingly innocent choice of presentation. This is a problem which is also, to some degree, present in the Hebrew Bible, and this isn't the only feature that Judeo-Christian writings and the Quran share. Most non-Muslim English speakers likely think of the Quran as roughly analogous to the Bible. After all, it is a holy book in the Abrahamic tradition and is roughly the length of the New Testament. However, the Quran and the Bible are quite distinct. The Bible contains many books. The Quran is a single book. The Bible contains what looks like pieces of poetry. The Quran is filled with what looks like pieces of poetry. Between the two, where poetry or rhyming prose does occur, they have different stylistic traits in their original languages. The Bible and Quran contain many of the same characters and events, but the accounts of these events and these characters' lives are often different between the two books. Additionally, the Quran does not have the same narrative structure of the Bible. Characters' stories are scattered throughout the book, and events regularly are repeated. For instance, the story of Noah occurs multiple times in the Quran, such as in Surah 11 and Surah 71. And the events are not described in the same way. The building of the ark occurs in Surah 11, but not in Surah 71. As Jack Miles pointed out, in Quran 71, Allah drowns Noah's people and then sends them to burn forever in hell. They were made to drown and herded into a fire. In other words, they died by drowning and then were punished in the fire of hell forever. Strikingly, there is no ark in this version of Noah's story, and there are no survivors except apparently Noah himself. This phenomenon is not unique to the Noah story. The story of Adam and Eve occurs multiple times in the Quran. Its details significantly differ from the account given in Genesis, involving characters who do not appear in the biblical account of the first man and woman. Of these new characters, one which stands out is a character named Iblis. Iblis appears throughout the Quran, usually taking on the role Satan or a demon might play in Judeo-Christian literature. In the story of Adam and Eve, he doesn't act like the snake in the Garden of Eden, but takes on a different role. Describing Iblis's role in the story of the first humans, Daniel A. Madigan wrote, "When God tells the angels of his intention to create a human being, they protest, knowing the trouble that will be wrought on earth by this creature made from black mud. At the moment of creation, the angels are ordered by God to bow down to Adam, and they do so, with the exception of Iblis, who is then condemned for his rebellion and becomes the enemy and tempter of humanity." The story is told 7 times in the Qur'an, each time in a slightly different form. This account of a refusal to bow is not unique to the Qur'an. It occurs with another character, Satan, in the life of Adam and Eve, as well as in the Book of the Cave of Treasures. Other related stories from the Abrahamic religions also seem to have made their mark on the Qur'an. Readers familiar with the Talmud, Midrash, and apocryphal literature will likely recognize many elements of those stories reflected in the Qur'an. It borrows directly from these Jewish sources at times, though it does not always conform with the details of the Jewish texts. Here is a non-exhaustive list of examples pointed out by Abraham Geiger, summarized by Susanna Heschel. The mockery of Noah's Ark in Q1138 corresponds to Midrash Tanhuma's commentary on Noah, and the Quran's assertion that the waters of the flood were hot corresponds to passages in the Talmud. Both traditions exhort prayer while standing, prior cleansing with water or sand, and expect prayer to be said, if not silently, then in a low voice and not noisily. Praying while drunk is forbidden. Michael Graves elaborates with some more direct parallels. Throughout the Quran, Noah is presented as one who preached repentance to his contemporaries. Early Jewish and Christian sources commonly portray Noah as preaching repentance, as in the Sibylline oracles 1:129 and 1:148 through 198. Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews 174, Genesis Rabbah 37, 1 Clement 1:6, and the Apocalypse of Paul 50. The story is told in the Quran that Abraham as a young man demonstrated the futility of idolatry by breaking a collection of idols and then ironically blaming the deed on a larger idol. Afterwards, Abraham is rescued from fire. This story is found in Genesis Rabbah 38:13. In the Quran, Moses refuses to feed from wet nurses, which is a theme known from Bavli Sota 12b and Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews 2:225 through 227. Details from Christian apocryphal texts have also found their way into the Quran. In Surah 3, for example, we find that Mary, mother of Jesus, was raised by a man named Zacharias in the temple. W. St. Clair Tisdall pointed out that elements of the story exist in the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Less, and the Coptic History of the Virgin, among others. Another parallel in the Quran with the infancy story of Thomas is pointed out by Michael Graves. In Q5110, it is reported that Jesus fashioned a bird out of clay and then brought it to life by breathing into it. This is reminiscent of the account in the infancy story of Thomas, wherein the boy Jesus makes 12 sparrows out of clay and then brings them to life. Tisdall pointed out that an account of Jesus speaking as a baby in Surah 3 and Surah 19 occurs in another apocryphal work. Probably the source from which Muhammad borrowed the incident is Injilut Tufaliyah, better known as the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy. From a study of the book, there seems little room for doubt that it was translated into Arabic from the Coptic, in which language it may have been originally composed. Tisdall also provides a list of other apocryphal texts which the Quran borrows from. Now, the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy is one of a number of apocryphal works of late or of uncertain date, which were never by any Christian sect regarded as inspired. Others of the same class which have left their mark upon the Quran are the Gospel of Thomas the Israelite, the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Gospel of Nicodemus, otherwise called the Gesta Pilati, and the narrative of Joseph of Arimathea. There's one more source of Islamic thought beyond the strict Judeo-Christian traditions which almost certainly had a major impact on early Islamic thought: the Hanifs. Speakers of Arabic may recognize this word in the Qur'an itself. John Kaltner and Yunus Mirza describe the term Hanif as it appears in the Qur'an. Ibrahim, is described in Q 367 as a Hanif, which is translated as upright person, and is often understood to be someone who practices monotheism. The word Hanif appears 12 times in the Qur'an, with 8 of them referring to Abraham, who is the only person identified this way by name in the text. The term Hanif doesn't only appear in the Qur'an, but was used prior to its existence to refer to a distinct group of people who stood against idolatry and in favor of monotheism. One person, named Zayd ibn Amir, who clashed with the Quraysh, had an apparently large impact upon Islam. Tisdall wrote on Zayd and Islam, "The main principles which we have found mentioned as inculcated by Zayd is dwelt upon in the Qur'an also. Among these may be instanced: 1. The prohibition of killing infant daughters by burying them alive. 2. The acknowledgement of the unity of God. 3. The rejection of idolatry and the worship of Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and the other deities of the people. 4. The promise of future happiness in paradise or the garden. 5. The warning of the punishment reserved in hell for the wicked. 6. The denunciation of God's wrath upon the unbelievers. And 7. The application of the titles Al-Rahman, the Merciful, Al-Rab, the Lord, and Al-Ghafur, the Forgiving, to God. Besides all this, the Qur'an repeatedly, though indirectly, speaks of Abraham as Hanif, the chosen title of Zayd and his friends. The Qur'an does not only borrow from the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Hanifs. There are also elements of Zoroastrianism present in the text and, arguably, some concepts taken from Indian traditions. However, the evidence for Islam having borrowed directly from the Indian and Zoroastrian traditions is generally spurious, and, therefore, it will not be addressed here in depth. Suffice to say, someone involved in the production of the Qur'an took inspiration from Judeo-Christian literature, and possibly the literature of other religious traditions, whether that was Muhammad, Uthman, Zayd ibn Thabit, a group in Cairo, someone else, or a combination thereof. Tisdall concludes, Muhammad borrowed religious practices, beliefs, and legends from various different sources, yet he combined them in some measure into one more or less consistent whole, thus producing the religion of Islam. Some parts of this are good, and Islam contains certain great truths borrowed from other systems of religion, but it certainly does not contain a single new or lofty religious conception. To an unfamiliar Arabic reader, the Qur'an might appear like a book of poetry. Its chapters or surahs follow rhythmic structure, and its lines often rhyme in Arabic. But the rhythmic structure and rhymes are not often carried over into English translations. Some Arabic words actually appear in formations unique to the Qur'an for the purpose of following the rhyme scheme. For example, in Surah 95, verse 2, the term signing is used. Gabriel Reynolds comments, the word signing at the end of the second verse seems to be a version of Sinai, or Mount Sinai in Q 23:20. However, it has been changed to fit the rhyme of in Surah 95. Although since the form signing can also mean years, one modern translation renders this verse and the Mount of Ages. Surah 36, verse 69, however, makes it clear that the Qur'an is not a book of poetry. And we did not give Prophet Muhammad knowledge of poetry, nor is it befitting for him. It is not but a message and a clear Qur'an. It is strange for a book which appears in the form of rhyming, rhythmic verses to explicitly say that it is not poetry. Perhaps it means that the Qur'an should not be interpreted as mere poetry, but as a holy, direct message from Allah. Another answer to the issue is to say that the Qur'an is not a book of poetry, but is a book of rhyming prose, which is not an entirely satisfying answer, but is plausible. A literary form similar to poetry called saj was common to holy men of different traditions in the region where the Qur'an was written. Some parts of the Qur'an are distinctively recognizable as meeting this categorization, which is not poetry despite holding a rhyming and rhythmic structure. Angelical Neuwirth describes saj as follows. The early short surahs are styled in a kind of rhymed prose, labeled saj, known as the medium of the ancient Arabian soothsayers. Saj is a particularly succinct rhythmic diction where single phrases are marked by prose rhyme, fasila. This pattern of phonetic correspondence between the verse endings is not only looser than poetic rhyme, kafiya, but also more flexible, thus allowing semantically related verses to be bracketed by a rhyme of their own, and clearly distinct verse groups to be marked off. The Qur'an is not entirely comprised of saj, however. Different surahs provide a diverse range of meters and forms, which impact the genre in a case-by-case basis, sometimes with multiple forms appearing within a single surah, and with some surahs moving away from poetic form in general. Neuwirth goes on to say, in the later surahs, once this style has given way to a more loosely structured prose, with verses often exceeding one complete sentence, the rhyme often takes the form of a simple un or in pattern. Upon closer investigation, however, it is apparent that the rhyme as such is no longer charged with being an end marker for a verse, but there is now another device to mark the end. An entire syntactically stereotypical rhymed phrase concludes the verse. It is tempting to call this a cadenza in analogy to the final part of speech units in Gregorian chant, which arouse the expectation of an ending. The rhyming in the Qur'an is also considered distinct from poetic rhyming. Muslim scholars are careful to refer to the Qur'an's rhymes as fasila. The term fasila exists, apparently, for the sole purpose of differentiating the rhymes in the Qur'an from those in other forms of poetry. Normal rhymes are called kafiya. Why consider whether or not the Qur'an should be considered poetry? While it doesn't necessarily carry over into English, meter and rhyme is an important aspect of the Arabic text. Moreover, Islam has had an interesting relationship with poetry. Traditional Islamic sources are occasionally favorable towards poetry and poets, and, in other instances, very much anti-poetry and anti-poet. For instance, take these two quotes from Bukhari, narrated Ibn Umar. The Prophet said, "It is better for a man to fill the inside of his body with pus than to fill it with poetry." Narrated Al-Bara, the Prophet said to Hassan, "Lampoon them, the pagans, in verse, and Gabriel is with you." In the first, poetry is generally seen as negative, and in the second, poetic verses against pagans are clearly praised. Poetry and Islam have a strange relationship, both within and outside of the Qur'an. While sometimes poetry is looked down on, other times it is given respect. Sometimes, contrary to the Qur'an verse previously quoted, Muhammad is said to have recited poetry, though notably this only occurs prior to his alleged reception of the Qur'an from Gabriel. These and other quotes from traditional Islamic sources are compared by Sam Shamoun on answeringislam.org, linked below. I suggest reading that if you're interested in the subject. Islam's view of poets and poetry is not entirely consistent, and it makes for a fascinating research topic, but that is not the main purpose of this piece. Please be noted that the website Answering Islam is home to some problematic content. However, this particular article seems to be free of any such content and provides a thorough overview of traditional conflicts in Islam about poetry and poets. It's possible that the Quran's disapproval of poetry comes from the association of poetry and paganism. The iambic meter rajaz was a popular meter used by mystic poets and seers who would enter excitatory states of mind and would deliver messages, apparently from the gods, often in the form of poetry. The rhyming prose of the Quran is often decidedly different than the poetry used by pagans in the region of Mecca in terms of meter and general structure. It may be the case that the meter was so different that the author of the Quran didn't consider it to be similar enough to label it poetry at all. Rhyming prose certainly seems like poetry to an English speaker, especially when it follows a constructed meter. But maybe it's sufficiently different in Arabic. In any case, statements made in the Quran about poets are often references to pagan poets, and indictments of poetry are often about pagan poetry in the region. With all of this information in mind, it is possible for us to finally answer the question, what is the Quran, with reasonable accuracy. Simply put, the Quran is an incredibly diverse book with a range of literary genres and presentations. Like the Bible, it contains elements of poetry, rhythmic and rhyming prose, and declarations. Despite its relatively short length, the Quran appears roughly as complex, arguably more complex, than the Bible as a literary work. It is an incredibly diverse book in terms of form and function. Obviously, the Quran is the holy text of Islam, and the principles laid out in it have religious importance to Muslims across the world. Competing claims exist about its original author or authors, but the modern Quran is likely not identical to its original form, whether through scribal error, memorization and recital errors over time, or intentional manipulation. Muhammad may have written it, Zayd ibn Thabit may have written it. It may or may not have been written in its original form at all. In its modern form, the Quran is a book which has gone through several formal revision efforts, with the latest major revision being its 114 surah compilation in Egypt in 1924. The Quran does not have a uniform genre, containing many genres within its surahs, also containing adaptations of stories from a slew of religious traditions, presented in rhythmic rhyming prose, which is similar to, but is not, poetry.